The marriage bed is prepared with silk imported from 3 continents. Incense burns in silver censers. Outside the chamber, 2 families wait in separate halls, one ruling, one recently conquered. The bride is 14. She has never met the man behind the door. Her father signed the treaty 3 months ago, and her name appeared in the annexes, listed between territorial concessions and mining rights. The door closes. The lock turns from the outside. Before dawn, a physician will enter to verify the union. Before noon, the empire will expand by 200 miles. This is the story history calls diplomacy. What it doesn't call is inventory. If you're interested in stories buried in the archives of power, consider subscribing. Now, let's return to the beginning. In every empire that has risen and fallen, women were never outside the system of power. They were instruments of it. The value assigned to a woman's body, her fertility, her bloodline, was determined with the same administrative precision used to measure grain stores and infantry strength. This was not accidental. It was policy, documented in contracts, encoded in law, and enforced by institutions that understood one principle above all others. Control over reproduction is control over the future. The language used was often beautiful: sacred duty, honorable alliance, divine purpose. But the documents that survived tell a different story. They list women by age, health status, family connections, and childbearing capacity. They record transfers of custody with the same bureaucratic efficiency as livestock inventories. The words changed across cultures and centuries, but the logic remained constant. A woman's worth was measured by what her body could produce for the state. Consider the Byzantine Empire in the 9th century. Imperial archives contain detailed correspondence between court officials regarding marriage arrangements. One letter, preserved in fragmentary condition, discusses a proposed union between a provincial governor's daughter and a military commander on the eastern frontier. The girl is described in terms that appear nowhere in descriptions of the groom. Her age is specified to the month. Her mother's fertility history is included. How many successful births? How many sons? A court physician's assessment of her physical constitution is attached. The letter notes, almost casually, that she has been educated enough to manage a household, but not enough to form independent political opinions. The language is clinical. There is no mention of her name until the 4th paragraph. Cruelty implies chaos. What the Byzantines practiced was order. The Byzantine administrative system was among the most sophisticated in the medieval world, and it applied that sophistication to every asset the empire possessed. Women of the aristocracy were assets. Their marriages were investments. Their bodies were contracts. The paperwork reflected this reality with perfect honesty. But the Byzantine Empire was not unique. Similar patterns appear across every major imperial system. In the Inca Empire, the institution of the aclla formalized the state's control over female bodies with remarkable efficiency. Beginning in childhood, girls identified as physically suitable were removed from their families and placed in state-controlled houses. Spanish chroniclers who encountered this system after the conquest struggled to describe it in their reports. Some called them chosen women. Others used the term virgins of the sun. But the administrative records the Spanish found told a clearer story. The aclla were categorized by age, beauty, skill, and family lineage. The most beautiful were reserved for religious sacrifice or marriage to the Sapa Inca himself. Others were distributed to provincial nobility as rewards for loyalty. Some were trained as weavers, producing the fine textiles that served as imperial currency. Their labor, their bodies, and their futures belonged entirely to the state. They could not leave. They could not marry without permission. Violations were punishable by death. not just for the woman, but for her entire family. One Spanish account, written by a priest attempting to understand Inca social organization, describes visiting an aclla house shortly after the conquest. He writes of speaking to an older woman who had served as a supervisor. Through a translator, he asked why the system existed. Her answer, as he recorded it, was simple. The empire must continue. Women make the empire continue. The priest noted in his margin, they believe this is natural order. It was natural order, not in the sense of universal truth, but in the sense that it had been normalized so completely that questioning it became unthinkable. The apparatus of state control doesn't maintain itself through constant violence. It maintains itself by becoming invisible, by transforming political decisions into cultural common sense. The Inca system did this with extraordinary effectiveness. The removal of girls from their families wasn't presented as kidnapping, it was honor. Being chosen was a privilege that elevated not just the girl, but her entire community. And most communities complied, because refusal meant losing access to state resources, because rebellion meant military intervention, because the system had existed longer than anyone could remember, and resistance seemed not just dangerous, but somehow wrong. Power doesn't maintain itself through constant application of force. It builds systems so comprehensive that compliance feels like participation. The Mughal Empire in India developed this principle into high art. The zenana, the women's quarters of the palace, was often described by European visitors as a place of mystery and oriental luxury. What they couldn't see, or chose not to record, was that it was also a political institution, governed by rigid hierarchy and careful documentation. Women entered the imperial household through multiple channels: marriage alliances, gifts from subordinate rulers, purchases, and conquest. Once inside, they were catalogued, ranked, and assigned roles based on their utility to the emperor and the dynasty. Mughal administrative records include detailed registers of the zenana. These documents list women by origin, date of entry, status category, and stipend level. They note which women had produced sons, which had produced only daughters, and which had failed to conceive. The highest-ranking women wielded genuine political influence, managing vast estates and patronage networks. But their power was always contingent, always dependent on maintaining their position within a system they could never leave. European observers often remarked on the apparent luxury of these women's lives. They lived in magnificent apartments. They wore extraordinary jewels. They commanded servants and received educated visitors. But luxury is not freedom. One Venetian merchant's account from 1640 describes a conversation with a eunuch administrator about the palace women. The merchant asked if the women were content. The administrator's response, translated from Persian, was recorded as, "Content is not the correct word. They are provided for. They are protected. They are necessary." Necessary. Not happy, not fulfilled. Necessary. Like grain stores, like armories, like the infrastructure of empire. Each successive empire studied what came before. The mechanism of control became more refined with each innovation in imperial bureaucracy. The Ottoman Empire's harem system incorporated elements from Byzantine, Persian, and Islamic legal traditions, creating an institution of remarkable administrative complexity. Young women and girls, many captured in military campaigns or purchased from slave markets, entered the palace as the lowest-ranking servants. Through a combination of training, beauty, intelligence, and fortune, some could rise to positions of extraordinary influence. The mother of a sultan wielded power that rivaled ministers and generals. But this possibility of advancement was itself a mechanism of control. It created investment in the system. It encouraged competition among the women rather than solidarity. It made the harem self-regulating, with its own internal hierarchies and enforcement mechanisms. Ottoman administrative manuals describe the protocols in clinical detail: how new arrivals were processed, how they were educated, how they were presented to the Sultan, how pregnancies were recorded, how births were verified, how sons were separated from mothers and raised by the state. One particularly revealing document, a late 18th century palace regulation, addresses what should happen if a woman attempted to leave. The punishment is not described. What is described, with bureaucratic thoroughness, is the procedure for updating the registers, the redistribution of her quarters and stipend, and the notification protocol for anyone who might have been in correspondence with her. The woman herself disappears from the text. Only the administrative cleanup remains. The pattern repeats across continents and centuries. When a woman stepped outside her assigned role, she didn't just face punishment, she faced erasure. Her name would be removed from registers. Her children might be reassigned or erased from succession documents. In extreme cases, historical chronicles would be edited to eliminate references to her existence. The empire protected itself not just by punishing transgression, but by retroactively denying that the transgressor had ever mattered. The Romanov court in Russia employed similar techniques. When Peter the Great's first wife, Eudoxia, opposed his reforms, she wasn't executed. She was forced into a convent, given a new religious name, and legally ceased to exist as the Tsar's wife. The marriage was annulled retroactively. Official histories referred to Peter's second wife, Catherine, as if she had always been the first. Eudoxia lived for decades after her removal, but in every document that mattered, she had already died. Her son, Alexei, who sided with her, was interrogated, tortured, and died in prison. But the official announcement of his death attributed it to natural causes brought on by his own moral weakness. The torture was never mentioned in any document meant for foreign courts. The historical record, as presented to the world, showed only that a dissolute prince had succumbed to his own failings. The state's violence disappeared into the language of divine judgment and personal flaw. The body can be destroyed. The record is harder to kill. Yet these systems learned how to kill both. They don't just control bodies, they control the story of what happened to those bodies. The archive becomes a weapon. What is recorded, what is omitted, what is revised. These choices determine what future generations will believe was possible, was normal, was inevitable. Wait, stop here for a moment. Consider what this means. These weren't isolated incidents. This was procedure. Every empire that controlled territory also developed bureaucratic systems to control women. The techniques varied. The legal justifications varied. But the underlying logic was identical. Women's reproductive capacity was a resource to be managed, and the state had both the right and the duty to manage it. The people who designed these systems weren't monsters. They were administrators. They were jurists. They were religious scholars. They believed, sincerely in many cases, that they were creating order, ensuring dynastic stability, protecting the social fabric. The documents they left behind show no awareness that they were inflicting harm. They show only concern for proper procedure, legal consistency, and administrative efficiency. Here lies the disturbing truth at the center of these histories. The cruelty wasn't the breakdown of civilization. It was the functioning of civilization. It was civilization working as designed. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty refined this understanding to an almost mathematical precision. Royal marriages were negotiated years in advance, sometimes before the bride was born. Contracts specified not just dowries and political alliances, but detailed protocols for the wedding night, pregnancy verification, and childbirth attendance. When a Spanish princess married a foreign king, she brought with her not just ladies-in-waiting, but physicians, priests, and legal witnesses whose sole function was to document her reproductive performance and ensure any children she bore could be legally proven as legitimate heirs. One marriage contract from 1615, preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, runs to 47 pages. It covers every conceivable contingency. What happens if the bride dies before producing an heir? What happens if she produces only daughters? What happens if she becomes infertile? What happens if her husband predeceases her? What happens if war breaks out between the two kingdoms? The bride herself is mentioned primarily as the vessel through which these various scenarios might occur. Her consent is noted in a single formulaic line. The rest of the document discusses her as a biological and political mechanism. The wedding took place as scheduled. The bride was 16. Records indicate she fulfilled her contractual obligations, producing 3 sons and 2 daughters over 12 years. She died in her 4th childbirth. She was 28. The diplomatic alliance her marriage created lasted another generation before collapsing in war. Her portrait hangs in a museum in Madrid, labeled with her function. Maria Anna of Spain, Queen of Hungary. Not Maria Anna who loved music, or Maria Anna who wrote letters to her sister, or Maria Anna who existed as a person. Just her title. Just her role in the mechanism. The reduction of a life to a function. Across the world, in the Qing dynasty of China, the same reduction was occurring with even greater procedural refinement. Imperial consort selection involved one of the most rigorous screening processes ever developed. Candidates were examined by physicians, evaluated by court matrons, and investigated for family background. Those who passed preliminary screening entered the Forbidden City for further assessment. Records from the Qianlong Emperor's reign show that the selection process included detailed physical examinations, tests of deportment and education, and investigations into the candidates' mothers' and grandmothers' fertility histories. One memoir, written decades later by a woman who had served as a lower-ranking consort, describes the experience of examination. She uses careful language, the language of someone who understood that even private writings might be read by authorities. She describes standing in a hall while court physicians and elder consorts evaluated her. Questions about her menstrual cycles, her diet, her family's history of childbearing. She describes the moment she understood that her personhood was irrelevant. What mattered was her potential utility. She writes, "I thought I was being honored. Later, I understood I was being inventoried." The memoir was discovered in the 1930s, hidden behind a panel in a building that had once been part of the palace complex. It had never been submitted to any archive. The woman who wrote it apparently never intended for it to be preserved in any official record. It survives only by accident, and most of what historians know about the daily reality of lower-ranking consorts comes from such accidental survivals, documents that escaped the system's control over its own narrative. Because the official records tell a different story. They describe a harmonious hierarchy, wise emperors making careful selections, honored women gratefully accepting their roles. Order, propriety, mutual benefit. Everything except what the system felt like from inside. Every imperial archive has this gap between official narrative and lived reality, between the ledger and the scream. What survives in that gap? Sometimes it's physical evidence. Archaeological excavations of palace complexes have uncovered quarters that don't appear in any architectural plans. Rooms that officially didn't exist, where women who had fallen from favor were confined. One excavation in Istanbul uncovered a sealed chamber containing the remains of 19 individuals, all female, all buried without markers or ceremony. Ottoman records from the relevant period make no mention of any deaths. The chamber was simply bricked over and forgotten. Sometimes it's marginal notations. A court record from Versailles includes a physician's note, squeezed into the margin of a childbirth registry, expressing concern that a particular woman had been pregnant 6 times in 7 years and might not survive another birth. The official entry simply lists the births. The margin note was apparently never meant to be part of the record, just a private observation that happened to be written down. Sometimes it's contradictions between documents. A letter from a Mughal nobleman to his brother mentions that his daughter has been called to court, using language that suggests honor. But a separate treasury document from the same year lists a payment to the same nobleman under a category that translates roughly as compensation for tribute. The two documents, read together, tell a different story than either tells alone. And sometimes it's silence. Gaps in the record where a name should appear. Registry entries that have been scraped away and written over. Chronicles that refer to the mother of Prince X without ever using her name. Historical accounts that mention a scandal but provide no details, only noting that the matter was resolved according to custom. What was the custom? The documents rarely say explicitly. They assume the reader already knows. And perhaps contemporary readers did know, but the knowledge wasn't preserved. Only the euphemism survived. Resolved according to custom. Removed for reasons of state. Retired to religious life. Departed the palace. These phrases appear across imperial archives in dozens of languages. They all mean something specific, something understood at the time. But the specific meaning has been lost, buried under layers of official discretion and deliberate vagueness. What we're left with is the shape of the absence. We know something happened. We know it happened to women. We know it was routine enough that it didn't require explanation. And we know it was serious enough that it required euphemism. The silences speak louder than the words. Systems maintain themselves across generations not by announcing their cruelty, but by making it normal. Not by defending their violence, but by making it invisible. Not by arguing that their logic is just, but by making it unquestionable. The British Empire applied these principles with characteristic bureaucratic thoroughness. The fishing fleet, unmarried British women shipped to India to marry colonial administrators, was marketed in England as adventure and opportunity. The private correspondence tells another story. Pressure from families unable to provide dowries. Limited options in a society that offered few alternatives to marriage. The understanding that refusing to go meant accepting poverty or dependency. One woman's letters, preserved in a colonial archive, describe arriving in Calcutta in 1847. She writes to her sister about the marriage market with bitter clarity. Evaluation by potential husbands based on youth, complexion, ability to manage Indian servants, family connections. She accepted a proposal from a man she had known for 3 weeks because the rainy season was coming and her temporary lodging would soon become uninhabitable. She described her wedding as a transaction completed with adequate ceremony. The marriage lasted 32 years. 7 children, 4 survived. After her husband's death, she returned to England as a respectable widow of the empire. Her obituary praised her dedication to colonial society and her role in raising sons who served the crown. No mention that she had been, in her own words, exported to India like cotton goods or tea. But her letters survived. Most women left no personal record, only official documentation of marriages, births, deaths. Their inner lives exist now only as speculation based on fragments that escaped destruction. Many fragments were deliberately destroyed. When the Raj ended, vast quantities of administrative records burned. Some of this was standard procedure, outdated documents disposed of during transition. But witnesses described seeing personal correspondence, medical records, court documents fed to fires with particular urgency. What was being destroyed? What was so sensitive it couldn't be allowed to pass into independent India's control? We don't know. The documents are gone. Only the fact of their destruction remains, noted in a few administrative memos that survived by accident. Every declining empire follows a similar script. As the system collapses, there's often a final effort to control the historical record, to ensure that the story future generations inherit is the story those in power want to tell. Archives are purged. Inconvenient documents disappear. Official histories are commissioned to provide the authorized version of events. But erasure is never perfect. Something always survives. A copy of a document that was supposed to be unique. A letter kept instead of burned. A building that was supposed to be demolished but wasn't. A story passed down orally that contradicts the official version. A detail in a foreign observer's account that doesn't match the empire's own narrative. These fragments don't give us the complete picture, but they give us enough. Enough to know the complete picture was different from the official story. Enough to know women experienced these systems differently than the systems described themselves. Enough to ask the question those systems never wanted asked. If this was normal, if this was legal, if this was accepted by society, does that make it acceptable? The empires are gone. The administrative systems that controlled women's bodies have been formally dismantled. But the question remains. When we look at historical systems of power and see that they functioned smoothly, that they were legally coherent, that they were culturally normalized, that they were considered enlightened in their time, does that mean they were just? Or does it mean that justice was defined by those who benefited from injustice? Consider what you just learned. None of these practices were hidden. They were documented, legalized, celebrated. They appeared in official records, in legal codes, in religious texts. They were defended by philosophers, justified by theologians, and administered by bureaucrats who believed they were serving the greater good. And yet, they treated human beings as inventory. They measured women's worth by their utility to the state. They erased those who resisted. They controlled the narrative so thoroughly that even now, centuries later, we struggle to hear the voices of those who were controlled. The mechanisms have changed. The language has evolved. But the question remains, how many of our current systems, the ones we consider normal, the ones we participate in without question, will be looked at by future generations with the same horrified incomprehension we feel when we look at these archives? What are we calling order that might be control? What are we calling opportunity that might be coercion? What are we documenting carefully, legally, properly, that might someday be evidence of our own systematic cruelty? The archives are still being written. The question is what they will say and who will be allowed to read them.